Forget the gray blocks of Cold War cinema. Forget the caricature of streets always under snow and guards at every corner. Imagine waking up in a single room that must answer for a whole life. A bed that is a couch by day. A wardrobe that holds the family's papers and the children's school books. A small table whose single drawer contains both the teaspoons and the ration cards. The wallpaper peels at the ceiling, revealing older layers like geological strata of previous households. You breathe, and the air is thin and sharp with the copper of the radiator and the faint, persistent smell of boiled cabbage that seems permanently lodged in the stairwell. In the distance, someone is already singing under their breath to a radio broadcast, a music program you know will be cut short by the news. You swing your legs out of bed, and the room is already alive in ways that feel intimate and public at once. Across the corridor, two doors open at the same minute because the household schedule has been rehearsed for years. The old woman next door, Nikolai's widow, needs the washing basin early. Dmitry Petrovich, who works at the nearby plant and takes morning shifts, will want to shave at 7 sharp before his tram ride. The children will need the basin to wash their faces and to knot their red pioneer scarves. The corridor's light is weak. The tile underfoot is uneven where someone once dropped an iron pan. You stand in a slow line outside the bathroom and count your morning by the small rituals. Warm water poured from a basin, a piece of soap cut thin, the soft clack of a samovar kettle being coaxed to a whistle in the other room. The bathroom is not yours in any private sense. It belongs to 8 households, by custom and convenience more than official decree. Each family has its hours, a shorthand timetable pinned into the memory of this building. You learn, early and without complaint, how to plan entire mornings around other people's toilet needs, how to fold your shower into 2 minutes of efficient motion, how to hold small courtesies that keep the communal machine running. At 8:30, the samovar will be set on the kitchen table, and someone will pour tea for whoever wants it. At 9, perhaps, an exchange will happen in front of the stairwell, tobacco for a bit of sugar, a half loaf of bread for an extra egg pulled from a cousin's private supply. These are not simply survival tactics, they become the shape of neighborliness itself. This is Leningrad in the 1950s, a city that is both scarred and stubbornly awake. The housing shortage after the war is a fact you sense in the building's layout. Large pre-revolutionary apartments carved up into communalkas, multiple households sharing kitchens, bathrooms, and sometimes the same oven. The word communalka, a communal apartment, denotes a lived economy of privacy knowingly renegotiated every morning.
It is a lesson in intimacy. Your life is performed in a narrow stage, and every gesture toward privacy is economical and deliberate. If you like this kind of historical deep dive, tap like and subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Among the households is a small single room that will, over the decades, become the anchor of a longer story. It belongs to a family with a father who works long shifts and a mother who keeps the samovar polished and the little domestic rituals intact. Their daughter, Natasha, is not yet 10. She sleeps in a corner bed with a quilt her grandmother sewed from flour sacks, and she wakes each morning to the polite noise of adult life already in motion. For Natasha, the communal apartment is less an imposition and more the only world she knows. She learns to navigate its social map with a kind of early competence. Who borrows sugar without asking? Who will always offer a bite of smoked fish? Which neighbor never speaks more than a nod, but will hide a warm loaf by the radiator for a child who cries at night? The communal apartment is also a classroom. It teaches lessons beyond sharing plates. It teaches how to translate a public ideology into a private practice. Posters hang in stairwells, young cosmonauts, slogans about production, a smiling worker's face. And at the same time, people barter and borrow, and they joke about long bureaucratic lines with a weary affection. In the afternoons, Natasha will join other children for a small rehearsal. They practice standing straight, tying the red scarf of the young pioneers with care, singing the songs that the school expects. The pioneers, and as she grows older, the Komsomol, will offer her not just ceremony but a pathway, group identity, access to youth camps, and later a smoother route into university and the kind of work the state needs. The pioneers are the children's movement, a ritualized discipline that marks birthdays and achievements, that gives a child a place in a social choreography. Komsomol membership will later open doors and assign opportunities of a different, more consequential kind. Natasha's childhood is punctuated by small, decisive encounters. At the neighborhood cinema, everyone squeezes into the dim hall for a screening of a new film. The black and white faces on the screen are larger than life, and the sound is slightly muffled, but the experience is communal and electric. Music arrives through the radio, and when it can, through vinyl. By the early 1960s, bootleg recordings begin to circulate on scratched records copied by hand. A melody from a Western song will be snuck into a private collection, played quietly at someone's kitchen table as if it were contraband perfume. These cultural crosscurrents will feed Natasha's awareness that the official culture, framed, curated, and distributed by state channels, is only part of how the world is lived. There is an undercurrent of taste that flows around the official river.
When Natasha is a teenager, she becomes increasingly visible to the institutions that shape young lives. Her teachers take note of her aptitude for numbers and geometry. A math teacher recommends she consider engineering. The suggestion is more than personal advice. In a system where the state plans educational paths and industries need trained personnel, such a recommendation can become a conveyor belt. The Komsomol office in the district keeps records and can nudge place be recommended is to be made legible to the bureaucracy that distributes scholarships, placements, and housing. For many families, this is a kind of security. It is the promise that the state will provide schooling, a job, and eventually a stable place to live. Not always the place you would have chosen for yourself, but shelter against another kind of uncertainty. Work is the theater of adult life. The nearest large employer is the Kirov Works, a factory that hums at the city's edge, and whose name carries both pride and the weight of expectation. Natasha will, in time, take a tram to shifts there. The tram is part of the city's pulse. Wooden benches, the skidding brakes at each stop, people pressing together in the early light, sharing the warmth of a neighbor's coat. Commuting is its own intimacy. Strangers, for the hour of it, assume a temporary, practical citizenship with one another. The factory itself is another kind of environment, a measured cacophony of lathes and hammers, the clack of a conveyor, the low metallic music that is machinery at scale. A horn marks shift changes. The whole plant moves like a clock whose inner gears are too large to watch closely. Inside the factory, the official language is production, output, 5-year plans, quotas. Quotas are the numbers that govern your day and your pay. They are both practical and performative. Meet your quota and you earn bonuses, praise, perhaps even a small household item at the factory store. Miss your quota and you risk reprimand or an unfavorable performance review. But quotas rarely tell the full story of what the plant produces. Machines break, supply chains falter, spare parts do not arrive on schedule. Here is where improvisation becomes the everyday ethic. Sergei from maintenance keeps a hidden stock of bolts and bearings, bought or swapped from another plant. Petro from the workshop can jerry-rig a lathe with a piece of scavenged steel. His solutions are messy but effective. These informal reserves, a coil of wire tucked in a locker, a roll of tape kept under a workbench, are the grease that keeps production moving. They are also social currency. You help me with a part today, I'll cover your quota tomorrow. The bonus system rewards quantity, and sometimes quantity trumps finesse. Quality controls exist, but so do expience. The result is an economy of favors layered over the official economy of plans. Management walks this terrain with its own precariousness. Comrade Vulov, the factory director, is a figure whose public duty is to deliver against the plan, and whose private decisions often pivot between ideological loyalty and the pragmatic needs of keeping the plant alive. He must appease inspectors, attend meetings where slogans are recited with the same cadence as a hymn, and also ensure that the assembly lines keep turning. Sakhalov, the chief engineer, understands machines deeply, but must answer to political oversight. In meetings, technical competence and political reliability are often weighed in the same breath, and every promotion, every assignment, has both a technical and a political dimension. The story of who is promoted, sometimes the technically skilled elder who knows his machines, sometimes the young party liner eager to show devotion, tells you as much about the system as the daily rhythm of bolts and belts. Natasha's first factory internships are full of small revelations. She learns how to read an old blueprint by its hand-smudged edges, how to coax a stubborn gear into alignment, and how to speak in the brief, pragmatic sentences of a shop floor. She also learns to navigate the informal networks, the senior woman who, with a curt nod, offers a tea break where the real troubleshooting happens, the workshop group that keeps a communal jar of coins for the maintenance worker who once helped them bypass a critical shortage. Natasha notices that competence earns respect, and that respect lives beside the need to be politically acceptable. She is young enough to hold a kind of impatient curiosity about both vectors.
The factory teaches a hard-won form of solidarity. There are moments of small tenderness that the official histories rarely name. A colleague who shares his lunch because your turn at the ration store was empty. A foreman who covers for a worker whose child is sick. A group of women who, at the end of their shift, trade domestic news and recipes like secret spells that make winter more bearable. These acts do not negate the system's constraints. They are accommodations within them. Over time, they become the daily evidence of how people endure. As the 1950s yield to the 1960s, the air itself changes. There is a faint thaw in political tone, an easing felt in cultural venues and in the cadence of some state pronouncements. Yuri Gagarin's flight is a moment of shared national pride that illuminates streets and newspapers alike. The thaw is not a rupture so much as a series of openings, a slightly more varied film repertoire, a cautious publishing of previously shelved works, a slightly more porous cultural surface. For Natasha, the thaw arrives as both opportunity and complication. It makes her think of the world beyond her building and beyond the plant. It makes certain cultural artifacts, an audio cassette copied by hand, a poem recited in a kitchen late at night, feel like small acts of cosmopolitanism. Housing policy begins to shift too.
The post-war years' desperate improvisations, whole families in single rooms, kitchens shared by dozens, start to be replaced by a bureaucratic promise of private space through the Khrushchevka, compact, standardized apartment blocks promoted during Khrushchev's tenure as a solution to the housing crisis. The Khrushchevka is modest, small rooms, low ceilings, but each apartment has a private bathroom and a kitchen that belongs to one family. For many, this is a material revolution of intimacy. The privacy of a bathroom, the ability to close a door at night, the daily dignity of waking up without negotiating for water, these remain practical and profound changes. When Natasha receives news of a promotion, a modest one at first, a better assignment in a different workshop with slightly higher pay, and crucially, a chance at allocation priority for a one-bedroom Khrushchevka apartment, it feels like a fissure in her life. The offer is not just about better tools or more prestige. It is, materially, the possibility to close a door and make a world of her own. The news spreads through the communal apartment in stages. The mother tells the neighbor while boiling cabbage. The neighbor pins a small congratulatory note on the hallway corkboard. Dmitri claps Natasha on the shoulder before he heads out to his tram. Natasha imagines arranging a corner with a chair and a lamp where she can read without having to negotiate a bedtime with 7 other people. The move itself is cinematic in its small details. The first time Natasha steps into the Khrushchevka flat, she notes the echo. Sound behaves differently in rooms that do not share walls with other households' activities. The bathroom has a lock that stays locked without explanation. She turns the faucet and warm water comes out without a schedule. The kitchen, though cramped, is hers, a domestic horizon that belongs to one family, to her future. She begins to inventory its possibilities, a place for a small record player, a shelf for a modest collection of books, a cupboard to hide a beloved but illicit vinyl. There is a small window that looks out over a courtyard where washing dries in neat lines. From that window, she can see the flow of people and trams like veins across the city, and she feels like someone who has been offered a private balcony onto public life.
Moscow's metro offers a civic contrast to this private shift. It remains a public spectacle, even as it is a daily commute. Stations are designed to impress, chandeliers and terrazzo, a sense that movement through the subterranean city is movement through a temple of progress. Natasha takes the metro to some professional meetings, and she senses the state's theatrical investment in public space. The metro demonstrates another form of the Soviet project's logic, monumental public spaces designed to communicate values, while private life migrates into the Khrushchevka's small rooms. By the mid-1960s, Natasha is no longer a child. She is part of work teams, she attends meetings where quotas are read aloud, she receives informal praise for a machine adjustment that saved a block of production. In the evenings, she sometimes shares bootleg records with neighbors, a scratched copy of a foreign tune that someone at the factory managed to acquire, and they listen in low voices, the music like contraband intimacy. She watches films at the cinema that are officially approved, and she also exchanges poems and songs that have a furtive life in kitchens. The culture of dual channels, state-provided and underground, is now a normal geography. The factory's rhythms change too. Some machines are replaced with newer models in the name of modernization, and sometimes the new machines do not run as expected because spare parts are slow to arrive. At other times, the personnel practices adapt, favoring those with political connections or those who can show improved output figures without always improving quality. Natasha learns that the system rewards certain kinds of reporting as much as it rewards real innovation. She witnesses small injustices and learns to work around them without losing her sense of craft. Her loyalty is to the machines and to the people who operate them, not always to the rhetoric printed in the factory bulletin. There are moments when the personal and the political cross in ways that leave a sting. An older worker is quietly demoted, not for the competence of his hands, but because an anonymous complaint questioned his political reliability. A bright young engineer with family connections quickly advances, their technical limits softened by patronage. Yet there are also moments of real recognition. A good idea saves an assembly line and the team shares a small reward. A veteran teacher is publicly thanked for decades of service. These contradictions do not resolve neatly. They simply accrete into the day-to-day texture of a social world that is not monolithic, but layered and sometimes contradictory. Evenings in the Khrushchevka are often modest rituals of care. The samovar may be replaced with an electric kettle, but tea remains central, a beverage that structures conversation and memory.
Guests come and go. A colleague from work brings a pocket of tangerines smuggled in from a relative's allotment. A friend returns a favored book with a note of thanks. These small exchanges reweave the social fabric in a private key. They are not evidence of an alternative society outside the state's presence. Rather, they are how people shape interior lives around external constraints. The 1960s also bring the first glimpses of a generational difference. Those who remember the siege and the war carry a set of scars and stoic stories. Younger colleagues, like Natasha, are more likely to talk about technical problems and cultural curiosities. They adopt new tastes, they copy clandestine records, they watch foreign films more than their parents did. But the older generation's languages of survival remain present. Ration cards, carefully mended clothes, a constant calculation of what to put away for a future no one promises. Across dinner tables and shop counters, the past and the present converse, and sometimes disagree. By the end of the decade, Natasha has a modest collection of things that mark her passage: a small toolkit, a certificate for a professional achievement, a scratched record that plays late-night melodies, and the keys to her own apartment. She knows how to read a machine the way some people read weather. She knows, too, that the city offers both spectacle and friction. The metro glitters, the factory grinds, and the living room carries music in a private register. The system still promises work and a place to live. It still imposes shortages and bureaucratic gaps. Natasha is learning the grammar of both assurances and absences. Yet life in the Khrushchevka does not feel like a plot fulfilled. It feels more like an accumulation of small freedoms and of new responsibilities. She begins to imagine projects she might pursue: a small course to deepen her engineering credentials, a room redecorated with thrift store finds, a weekend trip arranged with a group of colleagues who have put in for their annual putki, the state-subsidized vacation vouchers that make cheap holiday camps possible. These vacation vouchers are practical and symbolic. They mediate a notion of leisure that is part of the state's social contract. A sense of the city's larger future remains opaque. News of political shifts arrive at the edges: a television announcement with a carefully measured tone, a party bulletin read aloud in the factory hall. There is talk of modernization, of improving living standards, of shaping the workforce for the tasks ahead. But within the foundries and kitchens, daily life proceeds in increments. People learn to measure decades not just by leadership changes, but by the small markers of daily life. The winter when cold deliveries were late, the spring when an orchard of city trees bloomed later than usual, the summer when a friend finally received a long-awaited piece of furniture.
One evening, with rain freckling the kitchen window and the faint sound of a radio program in the next room, Natasha sets a record on her small player. The groove buzzes with static at first, and then fills the apartment with a melody that feels both foreign and familiar. She sits with a cup of tea and listens, aware that the music is a private thing in a public world. Outside, the building hums with the low, constant sound of life continuing: someone washing dishes, a tram braking, a neighbor calling from a stair. The new apartment is quiet enough to hear those small noises as separate little lives, but also connected enough that each of those noises has meaning. Natasha realizes she has crossed an important threshold, from a life that had to be performed in public to a life she can curate in fragments. Yet thresholds are rarely endpoints. They are doorways into further decisions and conflicts. The Khrushchevka provides new autonomy, but it also isolates the forms of mutual aid that once threaded through the communal apartment. The factory still needs parts that logistics will not always provide. The quota system continues to incentivize output over craft. The broader political climate offers cautious openings, even as it protects established power structures. Natasha's private record plays on, and the melody begins to feel like a small promise that music and taste can outlast shortages and slogans. The late afternoon light falls differently in the Khrushchevka than in the old communal corridor. It does not change the facts of rationing or quotas, but it rearranges the meaning of a single room. For the moment, the story pauses on this small interior scene. Natasha, the record, a cup of tea cooling at her elbow, a city moving through its familiar patterns. Outside, the tram wheels glint. Somewhere in the factory, the brake horn will sound soon. There are plans to meet, work to be done, and the slow accumulation of years that will shape the next decades. The apartment door closes behind her, and the new soundscape of private life settles in. A different kind of negotiation with the state's promises and the stubborn, improvisational realities that always make life possible. The new soundscape of private life settles in, but life keeps collecting in its slow, centrifugal way. Years accumulate not as a headline but as a series of small logistics: a colleague's wedding, a package of sugar arriving from a distant relative, the season when coal deliveries are late and the apartment grows thin with cold. The 1970s arrive not as an abrupt break but as an extended weather front, steady, gray at moments, warm in others, bringing with them a particular tempo that will come to be called stagnation by later reckoning. For Natasha, the decade is mostly work, friendship, and a growing archive of private tastes that make her apartment feel like an argument for a life not entirely prescribed. Work becomes steadier.
Her hands know the machines by a kind of affectionate familiarity, where a bolt likes to bind, how a lathe will hum before it needs attention, the precise shuffle of tools that precedes a successful morning. She is no longer the young intern who translates blueprints into novice confidence. She is a respected engineer in her workshop, the kind of person younger workers come to when a gear refuses to settle. The factory hums on. New models of equipment appear occasionally, promised advances meant to streamline production, but often arrive without the spare parts or the manuals to make them run as advertised. Where the paperwork expects modernization, the plant often stitches its survival together with improvisation, knowledge passed mouth to ear, and favors that function like a parallel currency. Between the measured rhythm of shifts are episodes of small commerce and mutual aid that sustain the social economy. Someone from the stamping shop keeps a secret drawer of screws, a foreman stores a length of hose salvaged from a decommissioned machine, and women in the finishing line tuck a little sugar away for colleagues who have run dry. Sergei and Petro remain the quiet custodians of these caches, men whose reputations rest on knowing who to trust and when to call a favor. In this system, favors are ledger entries of kindness. You cover my extra shift, and I will put a good word for you during the next allocation review. At times, these exchanges feel like a communal fabric, threaded, patched, and resilient in ways official reports cannot capture. The bonus system still shapes choices. Bonuses lure production, they encourage quantity, and sometimes prompt inventive reporting. Teams will rearrange work schedules or create safe margins in plans to hit figures that secure a token reward, a new kettle for the communal kitchen, a small appliance for a deserved teacher, or a modest recognition in the factory hall. These rewards are not simply material. They are signposts of standing. They say, in a practical language, that your effort was seen. Yet the system's arithmetic often privileges output numbers over the invisible craft that keeps machinery alive. Natasha grows adept at balancing both, meeting quotas when it matters, advocating for sensible repair schedules, and quietly teaching younger colleagues the patience needed for genuine craft. Outside the plant, culture is a field of layered textures. Official culture has its rituals, the cinema premieres that pack the darkened halls, the television programs that punctuate an evening, the state record label that produces music officially permitted for nationwide circulation. But beneath and beside that official layer is a quieter circulation of tastes, bootleg records pressed from a scratched copy, poems that travel folded in pockets, songs hummed softly at kitchen tables. Vladimir Vysotsky's voice, rough, human, and sometimes rawly witty, slips through radio static and private recordings. People quote his lines in kitchens, not as political statements, but as companionship. The Beatles, when they can be heard, are not a political threat so much as a doorway to another accent of longing. Cultural life is not simply split between permitted and forbidden, it is braided, state broadcasts and contraband melodies overlapping in the same evenings, both shaping what people hum as they wash dishes or mend socks. Natasha's circle widens. Olga, who trained as a doctor, brings a different vocabulary to conversations, one shaped by clinics, night call, and human fragility that can't be fixed by quotas. Victor, who works in a municipal office, has a kind of administrative wisdom. He knows which windows open and which are best left closed. Irina, a friend from the university, paints in afternoons between shop visits and offers a sly, gentle critique of official aesthetics. These friendships are not dramatic in the novelistic sense. They are steady in a way that matters. The person who will pick you up from a late shift, the neighbor who will boil a pot of soup if you have a fever, the coworker who will sneak you a scratched record for your birthday. Home evenings collect into rituals. The kettle's whistle, the light from the small lamp over Natasha's reading chair, the record player's soft crackle. People gather in her apartment not to stage contrarian seminars, but to share the small, private materials of life. Recipes, news from relatives in the country, a stolen tangerine that tastes like a rare festival. These gatherings reveal the soft work of companionship. At one such night, Olga reads aloud a short story from a magazine that passed hands 3 times. The passage lands like a small benediction in the cramped room. They laugh at lines that land, exchange reparative advice for weary knees, and keep a quiet file of jokes that can turn a bad week sideways. Friendship in this context is a form of insurance as much as it is delight. But there are limits. The system's rationing and logistical mismatches persist more as rhythms than as emergencies for those who can navigate them. Yet the persistence of shortage is a social fact. A long winter brings listless queues, the municipal stores often empty of goods that appear in other people's cabinets, and the constant practice of asking. There are things you learn to ask for in a particular tone so as not to offend clerks, ways of exchanging news about which shop might have a small cache of cheap soap. Natasha keeps a mental map of where certain goods sometimes reappear and who will trade a favor for an extra loaf. The practice of asking is itself a daily competence, an art that sits beside engineering skill. As the 1970s proceed, the city grows older and grayer in its worn paint beauty. New apartment blocks rise, more Khrushchevkas and larger series buildings, but maintenance does not always keep pace. Playgrounds rust, elevators jerk, stairwells smell of damp. The public promise of stability manifests in the steady presence of jobs and in the relative safety of social services. It also shows strain in the form of aging infrastructure and a sense that the future will be a slower version of the present rather than a dramatic transformation. At the factory, older workers become anchors because their muscle memory for machines keeps production from stalling. The young technicians push for small innovations, a different arrangement of shop benches, a reworked workflow, and sometimes their ideas are accepted, sometimes they are deferred. Promotions continue to be a mix of merit and connections. Natasha sees talent rise and sometimes stall. She learns the quiet art of advising a promising engineer on how to present their success in a way that cannot be read as political threat, how to frame a technical improvement as team effort, how to keep personal pride modest in communal terms. She becomes, in this way, a steward of others' careers, and she sees mentorship as another mode of care. In the social sphere, a new vocabulary appears, samizat for unofficial literature circulated outside state channels, a new set of underground journals that travel hand to hand. People read them not necessarily to foment politics, but because they want other vocabularies and narratives. Poetry and short essays find private audiences. They are read aloud under the hush of kitchen lamps. These exchanges matter because they offer literature that do not neatly fit state catalogs, irony, inwardness, and experiments in form. They provide a reflexive space where private anxieties can be voiced less as complaint and more as shape of thought. There are small public resurrections of national pride and shared spectacle, too. Films like the Great Adventure Pictures, popular theatrical adaptations, and the steady rituals of city festivals provide shared moments.
The White Sun of the Desert, a film loved across generations, still circulates in jokes and reenactments. Yuri Gagarin's flight remains a civic myth that people reference across decades as if to keep a particular future alive. These cultural markers operate as communal anchors even when daily life feels piecemeal. The personal calendar also contains bureaucratic rituals, application lines for apartments, forms to be filed for a child's school placement, the long process for a foreign trip that most will never take. Prutki, the state-subsidized holiday vouchers, become small wins. Teams pool their weeks to ensure that someone in the group gets a week in a Black Sea sanatorium or at a camp in the north. People exchange names on a list, grumble about the allocation, and celebrate when a colleague brings back a box of citrus fruit as a souvenir.
A putveski is both a material pleasure and evidence that the social contract, however strained, still offers certain gratifications. Romance and domestic life move at their own pace. If Natasha marries or lives with a partner, it is treated here as small-scale and human, rather than epoch-defining. Relationships are negotiated within the same constraints and freedoms that govern everything else. Shared apartments, if they occur, are easier in a system where renting a private flat is an administrative process. Love letters are sometimes exchanged in shorthand on the margins of work plans. Couples make small bargains about shifts and kitchen schedules. Parenthood, if it appears, expands the ledger of needs. Another small person to warm, feed, and dress. Another set of rhymes to recite at night. Children as a category are woven into communal life. They wear pioneer scarves, they line up at school gates, they learn to tie the knot that marks membership in a larger ritual. Through these decades, Natasha's relations with the party and its apparatus are complex. She is not a zealot, nor is she an open dissident. Like many, she negotiates her public alignment with private preference. Party membership or association with Komsomol in earlier years still matters for career mobility and for social stability. It also binds you to a set of rituals you may accept in order to secure the material necessities for your family. Natasha understands this trade. She participates enough to be legible and credible where it counts, but she also tends a private taste for music and books that the state does not always explicitly endorse. Small acts of visible dissent, cracked jokes about meetings, private recitations of a line of a poem, are not, most times, dangerous. They are a form of survival, the human way of keeping the soul's ledger balanced. But the cost is real in some instances. An older colleague's career stalls after a whispered denunciation. An ambitious technician's promotion proves contingent upon a harmless-sounding loyalty oath. These episodes are part of the social grammar. Sometimes you learn to step aside. Sometimes you learn to stand firm in small things. Natasha measures risk and reward with a practiced hand. The late 1970s deepen a mood of quiet repetition. The quotidian comforts of the Khrushchevka accrue. The apartment now has a well-worn armchair, a small bookshelf, a curated selection of records, and photographs pinned with thumbtacks. Yet at a national level, voices begin to register fatigue. Hushed conversations point to a bloat in bureaucracy, to aging machines in factories across regions, and to a governing class more interested in preserving stability than in imaginative transformation. People notice glacialness in public administration and a reluctance to experiment. Still, for many, the steady income and the social guarantees, a teacher's pension, medical care that rarely leaves a person destitute, are not trivial. They are, for all their limitations, part of what keeps a family secure. In the cultural domain, Vysotsky's songs circulate widely and take on a mythic domestic role. His voice, recorded on brittle tapes and twice-duplicated vinyl, threads through kitchen gatherings and late-night walks. People quote him not as a manifesto, but because his lines articulate private grievances, absurdities, and small acts of defiant humor. Other performers, actors from beloved films, poets whose names appear in samizad, offer a kind of unofficial canon that people recite like prayers against tedium. The informal economy grows more structured. People who once traded favors and canned goods now cultivate networks that resemble small-scale markets. A woman in the district who knows the right producer to order preserves from, a handyman who will install a shelf for cash, a clerk who can quietly move you ahead on a waiting list for a small fee. These networks are not purely corrupt so much as pragmatic. They are cogs in the system that bend official scarcity into human sufficiency. Natasha participates without dramatics. She shares a pot of preserves with an elderly neighbor, trades a borrowed tool for the loan of a child's winter coat, and sometimes pays a small gratuity to a helpful clerk. A distinct feature of the decade is the way public spectacle continues while private life becomes ever more vivid. City squares host official parades and anniversaries, factories hold plaques and award ceremonies where the language of production is adorned with ribbons and photographs. But it is in the quiet rooms that real pleasures accumulate. An evening with friends, two who share a bottle of wine smuggled through a relative's trip, a houseguest who brings a cookbook from a provincial cousin. These are the small conjurings that make a life lively.
Into the late 1970s and the cusp of the 1980s comes a particular kind of exhaustion. Younger colleagues express detachment. Older workers worry about the aging machines that have no clear replacement parts. Health clinics are adequate in routine care, but tend to strain under less common needs, and the day-to-day maintenance of public infrastructure begins to feel reactive rather than anticipatory. For many, the idea that tomorrow will be a modest extension of yesterday becomes less a comfort and more an anxious loop. Yet people keep living. Weddings are held, births register in hospitals, and the city finds ways to measure its rhythms by the modest landmarks of human life. Natasha moves through these years with a steady hand. She upgrades her professional qualifications when an evening course is offered, she helps younger engineers map out career paths, and she learns to find space in her days for small delights. An afternoon spent at an exhibition, a weekend trip arranged with friends through a potviki, a special loaf of bread shared with Olga after a long hospital shift.
Her apartment, now deeply lived in, holds a catalog of her life: a dented teapot, a handwritten recipe, a certificate from a workshop competition pinned next to a theater flyer. These objects, together, narrate the private history that official statistics cannot encompass. Enter the early 1980s. The decade begins in a climate that feels familiar and yet slightly more brittle. Leadership changes at the national level are discussed in the margins. Television broadcasts announce what is necessary and move on. People watch and then return to their immediate labors. At work, machinery shows its age. A conveyor slows for reasons that are never fully explained in the monthly reports. Spare parts arrive late, and repairs become improvisations on improvisations. The plant's maintenance crew becomes a kind of subterranean nobility. Its members keep more of the production running than the formal planners realize. At home, the rituals persist. Natasha still boils tea in the same pot she has used for years, still places the same lamp in the corner for late-night reading. Her taste for music has deepened into an archive. Some records have frayed grooves. They include not only an old bootleg melody rounded out by static, but also traditional songs recorded long ago on the state label. She listens to Vysotsky and to quieter poets. She keeps one corner of the shelf for books that no longer fit neatly into the city's public banter, works passed between friends, marginal novels, and a slim volume of essays that circulate in the small Samizot community. A memorable scene marks an early 80s winter night when a blackout sweeps through their block. The elevator dies, stairwells go dark, and neighbors call out hallways looking for candles. Natasha's apartment is one light among many, windows rimmed with frost, the orange glow of a candle reflected on the glass. People gather downstairs with thermoses and a shared notion of making the best of darkness. A neighbor whips up a quick pot of tea on a small Primus stove. Someone tells a story that has been told so many times it becomes a ritual, and a visiting technician returns keys to a worker who once fixed his daughter's stroller. These are not dramatic acts of heroism. They are the ordinary patriotisms that stitch a community together. Social conversation begins to include a new term: stagnation. At first, it is a lightly ironic label, an acknowledgement that growth is slow and bureaucracy heavy. But the word also carries a deeper melancholy for some, the sense that the shape of life will not change dramatically, and that the state apparatus is content to maintain order rather than to innovate. This sentiment does not mean all hope is lost. It instead reflects a sober appraisal. Systems that do not renew themselves atrophy in small ways: blocked procurement lines, museums with fewer acquisitions, schools with fewer supplies. People adapt around these gaps. Natasha's own interior life grows more contemplative. She thinks about the years behind her with a certain tenderness, and about the future with practical curiosity. Friends disperse, some to other cities, some to retirement, some to quieter domestic cycles. Younger engineers she once mentored begin to take positions of responsibility. She watches them with a temper of pride and a touch of private worry about the long-term prospects for technical innovation, when the larger institutional incentives do not always reward deep experimentation. Culture continues to ripple. Artists like Vysotsky become emblematic of a voice that can speak to everyday absurdities and private defeats without offering tidy political programs. Movies still circulate with regional premieres. Children still reenact scenes from adventure films in schoolyards. Yet the unofficial circuits become more sophisticated. Bootlegs are replaced, in some circles, by reel-to-reel tape copies. Readers trade mimeographed pages of new essays at kitchen tables. The private sphere is rich, and it is often where a deeper sense of meaning is found. By 1983, a new cadence arrives in Natasha's life, a reflective evening in which the decade's accumulation folds in upon itself. The episode has the particular intimacy of a small ritual. She returns from work, the last streetlights breathing a weak gold on icy sidewalks. She crosses her threshold and turns the key, noticing at once the small domestic details that have become talismans. A photograph of Olga and her with a group of friends at a colleague's retirement party, a postcard from a distant cousin tucked into the cookbook, a small wooden box with a carved lid that holds stamps and a few foreign coins, tokens of travel some friends achieved long ago. She makes tea, and the kettle's whistle is a familiar punctuation. On the table, a plate holds a single tangerine someone saved for her, each segment a small sun. She moves by habit to the record player, selecting a disc with a rough spine that contains a set of songs she has loved for years. The needle settles. The music begins with the soft crackle of static, and then unfurls, Vysotsky's voice on one side, a classic film score on the other. The apartment seems to breathe with the melody. Outside, the muffled sounds of the city, trams, distant conversation, the occasional beep of a shop, thread through the windows. This evening she reads through a small stack of notes. One is a letter from a younger engineer she once mentored, now stationed in another region, thanking her for early advice and offering a sketch of life there. Another is an invitation to a modest exhibition. She lingers over the letter a moment longer, feeling the strange warmth of being part of a lineage, someone who teaches, someone who is remembered. The phone rings once. It is Olga, calling on her way home from the clinic. They exchange small news, about a patient who recovered, about a new repairman who was excellent, about a friend's child's graduation.
The conversation is domestic and tender, the kind of exchange that holds meaning precisely because it is small. The decade's arc rests in these details. The system has been generous in some ways, steady employment, a continuity of public services, and constraining in others, shortages, bureaucratic friction, and closed forms of political debate. Natasha knows both truths intimately. She has found ways to make beauty out of scarcity. She has a modest shelf of well-worn books, an array of recipes tested by winter, and a drawer of letters that read like a private geography of relationships. She also holds a pragmatic view of the state's promises. They offered a kind of social security that shaped millions of lives, but left many desires unmet. As she sits, the music threads to a quieter passage. She thinks of the children she has seen grow up in the neighborhood, the first pioneer proofs, the school plays, the shy teenagers who took secret pleasure in bootlegged tracks. She thinks of the older men in the workshop who keep the machines from seizing, of Dimitri's occasional visits with his clapping good humor and the neighborly loaf he shares, of the small kindnesses that make each winter bearable. In the apartment's lamplight she imagines, not in any specificity of policy, but in the feeling of possibility, that life might, sometime, find a different rhythm. The image is not a prophecy, but a humane hope, that systems change incrementally, and that new openings may come from the cracks people already live inside. It is not a dramatic prediction. It is a wish shaped by years of practice, of adapting, of forming networks, of cultivating inner life despite public limits. The year 1983 is quiet in newspapers and loud in private rooms. There are rumors of a younger generation more restless, of conversations that name long-standing mistakes with a candidness that surprises older listeners. There are also sober acknowledgments that many of the structural problems, aging infrastructure, stifled innovation, bureaucratic resistance, cannot be remedied without sustained political will. Natasha is careful about speculation. She prefers to remain anchored in what she knows, the lives of the people around her, and the practices that sustain them. Night deepens. The record finishes, and the apartment returns to the gentle domestic murmur. Natasha walks to the window, cradling a cup of tea. Below, the courtyard gathers its own small constellations, a solitary figure pacing with a child's pram, a neighbor returning late with a small paper bag, the tram's silhouette gliding past like a slow heartbeat. The city is both larger than any private life and intimately bound to it by the small exchanges that pass under doors and between stairwells. Sleep here is a private ritual that retains an echo of communal life.
In the shared bathrooms of the Kommunalka's decades, the act of sleep had been staged and negotiated. But in a Khrushchevka, bedtime is a chosen closing, a margin carved out from the day. Natasha turns off the lamp, pulls the blanket up, and listens to the nighttime sounds. Husbands returning from late shifts, a distant radio, the small creaks of settling buildings. A neighbor coughs somewhere in the block. A radio program ends. The house breathes as if in a minor chord. Before resting, she thinks of the neighbors, Dmitri with his plain acts of decency, the elderly widow who still leaves a small plate of preserved fruit outside her door for a child arriving late from school, Petro, who always has a story about a quick, jury-rigged repair that saved production. These are not heroic portraits. They are ordinary gestures of steadiness that together make the city navigable and humane. Toward morning, the thinking that inhabits Natasha's mind is not abstract policy analysis, but intimate calculation. Will the Putki for the factory leisure retreat be available next year? Should she put in a request for a professional course? How will the new technician fare in the next quarter? Her concerns are modest and precise, the engines of her life. In that way, they mirror a larger truth. History, for most people, registers less in cabinet meetings and more in the steady management of everyday troubles and the patient accumulation of small joys. The city's future is ambiguous from within its present. There are hints here and there, young people more fluent in foreign songs, a few more pages of unofficial literature circulated, a small but noticeable impatience at the ways procurement clerks delay simple repairs. But these are not deterministic signs. They are instead the material of lives quietly adjusting. Natasha's evening closes with a feeling of fragile continuity, a faith in human practice, rather than in any grand institutional promise. The secrets the title promised to unlock are not dramatic conspiracies. They are the textures, the way neighbors trade sugar in stairwell conversations, how a scratched record can feel like contraband perfume, the manner in which a worker keeps a secret stock of spare parts under a bench, the ritual of the samovar now replaced by an electric kettle, but still the locus of conversation. These are the techniques of survival and of dignity, small inventions and habits that allow people to live richly within constraint. As the narration folds, consider how different gestures, privacy carved out in tiny apartments, collective ingenuity in factories, cultural crosscurrents of whispered songs and bootleg tunes, compose a fuller, more humane image of life in the Soviet Union than what popular Cold War caricatures often suggest.
The period from the 1950s to the winter of 1983 is not a single story of oppression, nor is it an uncomplicated tale of success. It is a braided account of endurance, warmth, improvisation, and sometimes weary resignation. If a viewer asks what is most surprising about these lives, it may be the ordinary ways people resist reduction, by cultivating friendships, by forming informal economies that ease daily life, by keeping private tastes that preserve a sense of self. These actions are not political manifestos, they are practical ethics. They are the small rituals that make history legible in human terms. Which vignette surprised you the most? Was it the bathroom queues and samovar mornings, the improvisation of factory life, the small civilities of the Khrushchevka, or the clandestine circulation of music and literature? Share where you're watching from and which moment stayed with you in the comments, and subscribe to follow the next deep dive into how ordinary lives meet extraordinary structures.